6:37, Nashville's Morning News on Super Talk 99.7 WTN. Appreciate you being here along with Johnny B. and Ken Weaver. Want to welcome on into the program Dakota Wood. Always a fan favorite here on Nashville's Morning News. Dakota, always appreciate having you on. And I want to break down a couple of things that happened last night during the State of the Union. One is what President Biden said about putting some sort of a port in Gaza. We're going to talk about that. But first, I want to play this moment for you when the president was heckled last night.
Year before I took office, murder rates went up 30%. 30% they went up. The biggest increase in history. And it was then.
And so everybody wanting to know, Dakota, who that was, I will tell you who that was. That was the father of a fallen Marine. The man's name is Steve Nakui. His son, Kareem Nakui, was killed in Afghanistan on that horrific day. What he was screaming was Abbey Gate, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. And that, of course, harkens back to that horrible day when 13 of our military members were killed. And so he was actually, I guess they arrested him. But, you know, it remains obviously a very sore subject for all Americans, the horrific pullout of Afghanistan. And so talk a little bit about this moment where President Biden, I don't think he's ever going to be able to escape that failed pullout.
No, Ian, this is a classic blunder of politicians, is not being honest and just dealing with the issue, right? So one of the chief criticisms of Biden is that he has never officially acknowledged the 13 service members lost, by names or maybe saying it could have been handled better, whatever. So, he hasn't met with the families. He hasn't acknowledged the individuals. And so that grieving father still was calling out Abbey Gate. That was the gate there at the airport on the south side of Kabul in Afghanistan. And amidst all that mayhem of trying to evacuate Americans and Afghanis, from that country with the precipitous withdrawal, suicide bomber got through the packed crowd, detonated his suicide vest, and killed a bunch of Americans and even more Afghanis that were crowding around the gate trying to get out, right? So it's failure to acknowledge what happened and just thinking that you can go on. And clearly Biden has done that. But there are so many families and others who are just struck by this tragedy. That young Marine's brother committed suicide out of despair, just shy of the 1-year anniversary of them losing their son and brother. And the family has just been dealing with a lot of torment on that. So the father had been invited by his local representative to attend the event. The representative fully supports what the father was doing and the failure of the administration to acknowledge what happened in Afghanistan. And I doubt that he'll be charged with anything. It would just be a terrific miscarriage of justice on that. But it was one of those moments where somebody's going to say something and the administration cannot escape, right, these charges of destiny.
No, and I'll tell you, and I've said this before, that failed pullout of Afghanistan, that really was the moment where the American people started to turn on Joe Biden. And that's when his numbers really started to plummet and people began to realize that this administration left a lot to be desired. One of the other things that he said last night, Dakota Wood joining us, and we're talking about the President's State of the Union last night. He did speak about Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, and he also at one point invoked the name Ronald Reagan. But this is part of what he said.
At the very same time, overseas, Putin of Russia is on the march, invading Ukraine and sowing chaos throughout Europe and beyond. If anybody in this room thinks Putin will stop at Ukraine, I assure you he will not.
So there was that moment, Dakota, and he also, when he did speak about Ronald Reagan, he brought up Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. I think context here is everything.
Wasn't long ago when a Republican president named Ronald Reagan thundered, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Now my predecessor, a former Republican president, tells Putin, quote, "Do whatever the hell you want." That's a quote. A former president actually said that bowing down to a Russian leader, I think it's outrageous, it's dangerous, and it's unacceptable.
You know, it's interesting, Dakota, because as the president is talking about that, all that I could think about was Vladimir Putin and how he was emboldened to go into Ukraine after the failed pullout of Afghanistan and all those very weak sanctions that Biden tried to level to keep Putin out, which obviously were not successful.
The reason Putin is in a position to go further, and I do agree with Biden on that point, that he won't stop just in Afghanistan, is because the Biden administration was so hesitant, so timid, so risk-averse to do much at all to help Ukraine in the very opening days of that war, right? So they withheld support leading up to the invasion. After the invasion occurred, they kind of gave up the Ukrainian cause because they figured everything was going to collapse. And then ever since that time, so many restrictions have been placed on the support given to Ukraine. You can't attack Russian targets inside of Russia. You can't do this. You can't do that, while Putin can do anything he wants. And now to say is the time to rise up and stop Putin in his march across Europe. I mean, Biden enabled this thing. And going back to your point about Afghanistan, when you show weakness and timidity, failure to execute well, rushed plans that are just kind of spoken in a hurried moment, and then the military has to try to execute those sorts of things. It absolutely sends this message. Iran has not been deterred or cowed. China does whatever it wants in its half of the world. Russia is doing what we've seen and will continue on through Ukraine, probably into Romania, threaten the Baltic states. Lithuania in particular, it's building up its presence. Reports are it's already moved nuclear weapons back into Belarus. So this is a mess of Biden's own making. And to equate what he is doing with what Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II and Margaret Thatcher did to confront the Soviet Union after how many decades of Soviet domination in Eastern Europe, I mean, it's a completely misguided analogy. And then, of course, the entire thing was nothing but a campaign speech anyway to denigrate his challenger, his competitor, Donald Trump, leading into the general election cycle this summer. So, the whole speech had to have been written by Winston Smith, who worked for the Ministry of Truth in Orwell's novel 1984. It was just a complete twisting of facts and artful wording, and this angry old guy up there berating half the country, right? Anything the Republicans did or the conservatives did is bad. Anything that the liberal progressives want to do is absolutely the way to go. So if you watch that crowd, the only ones standing and cheering were the Democrats, insulted, the Supreme Court justices. I mean, it just went on and on. It was a theatrical event. And, you had to have some popcorn and a stiff drink, I think, to watch it.
I think maybe that's what Nancy Pelosi was doing. It's 6:45 on Super Talk. So the president wants to get aid into Gaza. This is what he said last night.
Tonight, I'm directing the U.S. military to lead an emergency mission to establish a temporary pier in the Mediterranean on the coast of Gaza that can receive large shipments carrying food, water, medicine, and temporary shelters. No U.S. boots will be on the ground. A temporary pier will enable a massive increase in the amount of humanitarian assistance getting into Gaza every day.
All right, so that's what the president wants to do. There's some people that are saying, and I've seen analysis all over the place on this one. So he wants to get aid in, and he thinks that he can do it by boat.
Well, you can have an idea. It can be a really bad idea, right? And I think this is one of those. So the U.S. military does have systems to create like a fishing pier, something like that, a little causeway that stretches from the beach out to the sea. Most of those are floating, so they're very dependent on sea state, but the Navy has this thing called an elevated causeway, a modular system. It can stretch out something like 3,000 feet, rises about 20 feet off the water, and you have to put in these steel pilings, right, like telephone pole sorts of things that go out, just like a fishing pier. And then these sections are put together. They range from about 24 feet wide as you get close to the beach, and then they double or triple that width when you have this little pier section at the end that ships would pull up to. It's got some turntables on it so trucks can drive out. the table, turns the truck around so they can drive back, has a couple of cranes on the thing. It'll take 2 weeks to deploy it from the East Coast to the United States just to get it into position. It takes about 2 weeks or so to put together. And then the question is, who is going to operate it? So is it technically possible? Absolutely it is. These systems are about $60 million a piece. I think this particular version, we've got 2 of them, only one or 2 of them on the East Coast. So you can do it technically, but then the problems are crowd control, distribution once you get on land. Our country's going to be willing to bring their ships in close enough for containers to be offloaded onto trucks. Who is providing the trucks? So all of these issues have to be worked out. They're going to have initial staging in the island of Cyprus, and then you would ferry the things over to this particular pier. But the execution, it's kind of like Afghanistan. We want to withdraw from Afghanistan, got it. How do you go about doing that? What are the practical realities on the ground? And the administration hasn't said anything about that.
Lastly, Dakota, there's a local story. I don't know if you've heard it, but I think you can hit on some general principles. Mm-hmm. We've got a U.S. Army soldier from Fort Campbell here in Tennessee. His name is Corbin Schultz, Army intelligence officer, an analyst with the 1st Battalion of the 506th Infantry Regiment at Fort Campbell. And he's now been arrested. And what he's accused of doing is selling, secrets to China. $42,000 is what he got back. And, we keep seeing these stories of members of our military being caught in these kinds of situations. How prevalent, and I feel like this is an easy question, how prevalent is this where China reaches out to members of our military and engages them in a relationship so that our people will sell them military secrets?
Well, they try that all the time. I mean, they do that. The Russians do that. Any foreign power is going to try to develop a relationship. The Chinese are very, very intentional about it. And you do hear about these cases. There was another one similar to this with a Navy officer that was involved in things. Sometimes they're civilians, sometimes they're military. But let's, put things in perspective. You've got an active duty military of about 1.2 million people. And once a year or thereabouts, you hear about somebody who has been bought off and they want the cash for whatever reason, or maybe they're angry about some U.S. policy that decide to help the enemy. So these things do happen. They're very rare when they do, but when they do occur, because they're so rare, they make a lot of news on that, right? Very newsworthy. The nature of the intel that can be provided will vary depending on the individual and their access, what kind of information you're sharing. But if you're China, anything, right, is good. And just another point here, Chinese penetration into the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, U.S. government accounts, White House file servers, email accounts, all the cyber espionage that has occurred. I mean, it happens, and it tells you that our enemies are at work, and they will, corrupt somebody here on the American side from time to time.
So what do we do as far as China goes? I mean, so we're going to, punish our guy. Any retaliatory thing we can do against China? I'm assuming that we're trying to do the same thing, but I don't know how successful we are.
Yeah, that's one of the most closely guarded secrets. You don't want your competitor to know what you can and can't do, so everybody obscures truth with myth and fog and friction and all that kind of good stuff, right? So yes, we are actively involved trying to get what we would want to know known out of China, but you don't want to disclose methods and success and those sorts of things, right? But it tells you that we are in active competition with other countries around the world, and you have to be guarded about that. What are we going to do about it? If it's the Biden administration, not much, right? When we just talked about risk aversion, not wanting to cause problems, especially in an election year. All these sanctions that have been placed on Russian officials to try to shape behavior, hasn't had any success. Iran is in near nuclear power, in spite of U.S. policies that, impose sanctions and those sorts of things. So, the response to this one particular alleged incident, it's not going to cause a ripple in the Washington, D.C. landscape.
All right, 6:51. Always great to have you on. Dakota, have a great weekend.